They told my wife I was dead before the night even started, somewhere between the summit of Everest and the long drop into Tibet. My mind slipped its gears. One moment I was descending behind the Sherpas, counting each careful step down the fixed ropes. The next, I was convinced I was standing on the roof of a house by the sea, asking someone to bring me a cup of tea. That's what high-altitude cerebral edema does. It rewires reality until the mountain looks like a backyard, and 8,600 meters feels like a sleepy afternoon. I fought the men who tried to save me. I tore at my oxygen mask, shrugged out of my downsuit, argued that I didn't need to go down because, in my broken mind, I was already home. When I finally collapsed near the second step, they spent hours trying to drag me along the ridge. My eyes rolled. My words stopped making sense. At some point, my pulse did too. In the fading light, surrounded by wind and ice and the knowledge that they also had families, the order came over the radio. Leave him. He's gone. They took my pack, my sleeping bag, my oxygen, my water, things I had no use for if I was a corpse, and they went down to save themselves. At base camp, a message went out to Australia. Lincoln Hall has died on Everest. But death on this mountain isn't always a clean line. That night, alone in the death zone without oxygen, food or shelter, something strange happened. My body began to freeze. My mind wandered through hallucinations and Buddhist images of the stages of dying, and yet a part of me kept insisting, not yet. So when 4 climbers climbed up the next morning and saw a man sitting cross-legged on the ridge, coat open, no gloves, changing his shirt, I greeted them the only way that felt right. "I imagine you're surprised to see me here," I said. "My name is Lincoln Hall. On the 25th of May, 2006, I reached the summit of Mount Everest by the North Ridge, on the Tibetan side. By that evening, I was officially dead, declared gone by my own expedition, mourned by my family, and written into the statistics of that season's 11 fatalities. Yet 12 hours later, I was sitting at 8,600 meters in the death zone, frostbitten, hallucinating, but somehow alive enough to hold a conversation. This is not a hero story. I didn't make brave, noble choices up there. I made confused, stubborn ones. Cerebral edema turned me into a danger to the Sherpas trying to help me. The real heroes were the climbers who gave up their own summit, and the Sherpas who came back for a man who, on paper, had already had his funeral. In the next chapters, you'll walk with me from the summit to the moment everything went black, through the night alone above the world, and into the impossible morning when the mountain decided I wasn't finished yet. You'll hear what dying on Everest feels like, from the inside. If stories like this reach something in you, stay with me to the end. And before we drop into Chapter 1, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're listening from, so I know how far this night on Everest has traveled. Everest did not begin for me in 2006. It began 22 years earlier, in 1984, when I stood on its north face as part of the first Australian expedition to attempt a new route across the Northern Couloir. We called that route White Limbo, and for a while it felt like the phrase described my whole life, suspended between success and disaster, between the thin air of high places and the thicker air of ordinary responsibilities back home. Back then I was young, lean, and convinced that enough determination could bend any mountain to my will. We climbed in lightweight style, no bottled oxygen, small team, big ambitions. I learned very quickly that Everest finds the cracks in that kind of confidence. We were hammered by storms, battered by altitude, and reminded day after day that this peak doesn't care how much your country believes in you or how many headlines are waiting if you succeed. We did reach extraordinary heights in 1984, forging a new line on the north face, but illness and weather forced me back short of the summit. I descended sick, half delirious, and spent nights out high on the mountain when I should have been far lower. By the time I finally returned to Australia through a chain of hospitals and airports, people were already calling the expedition a triumph. I smiled for photos, gave talks, wrote White Limbo, and quietly carried a private disappointment. I had touched the edge of Everest, but not its highest point. Life filled in over the next 2 decades. I married, became a father, turned mountaineering into a mixture of guiding, writing, and speaking. I climbed other peaks and learned to enjoy less dangerous kinds of achievement, watching my children grow, building a home with my wife, Deb. On stage, I could talk about risk and reward as if Everest were a closed chapter. But at night, when things were quiet, the mountain still arrived uninvited in my thoughts. The crunch of crampons on blue ice, the sight of that white pyramid rising above the Tibetan plateau. So when an opportunity came in 2006 to return to Everest, again from the north side, this time with the chance to stand on the actual summit at last, I said yes more quickly than a man with my responsibilities probably should have. I told myself it was about finishing an old story, about honoring the younger climber who had turned back when the price of continuing was too high. Underneath that, if I am honest, there was something more selfish. I wanted to know who I was, without the word almost attached to my name. This time, there were cameras involved. Our expedition had sponsorship and a documentary crew tracking our progress. It sounds glamorous, but what it really meant was that each decision carried an invisible audience. Viewers would eventually watch me clip into ropes, cross ladders, crawl into my tent after brutal days. They would see whether the 50-year-old Lincoln Hall had finally settled his unfinished business with the mountain. As our convoy rolled across the dry Tibetan plateau toward base camp, Everest slowly climbed out of the haze. From far away, it looks clean and geometric, just snow and rock and sky. Get closer, and the details sharpen. The scars of old avalanches, the black ribs of rock where the wind has eaten the snow, the thin plume of spindrift whipping off the summit like smoke from a cold fire. Standing there at Chinese base camp for the first time in more than 2 decades, I felt 2 conflicting things at once. One was gratitude. How many people get a second chance at a dream like this at 50? The other was a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. In 1984, I had walked away sick but alive. The mountain had already shown me how quickly things could go wrong up here. I knew, in a way younger climbers sometimes don't, that there is a line for every person beyond which desire turns into recklessness. I told myself I would respect that line this time. I would climb cautiously, listen to my body, turn back if the cost became too high. It sounded noble in the relative safety of base camp, where the air, though thin, still allowed clear thought. I could make promises there. What I couldn't see from that rocky valley, surrounded by prayer flags and yaks and the controlled chaos of international expeditions, was how completely those promises would unravel when I was starved of oxygen above 8,500 meters. I couldn't yet imagine the moment when the man who had spent 22 years longing for Everest's summit would lie down near the second step and tell the Sherpas trying to save him that he was already home. For now, in those early days at base camp, all I felt was the pull of unfinished business and the quiet thrill of finally returning to the place that had haunted me. I checked gear, sorted food, laughed with teammates, filmed interviews about calculated risk and respect for the mountain. If you've ever gone back to something you swore you were finished with, a relationship, an addiction, a dangerous dream, you know that feeling. You convince everyone, including yourself, that this time will be different. As we began the first acclimatization climbs toward the North Pole, I believed that with all my heart. I had no idea that Everest was preparing to show me just how thin the line is between unfinished business and final chapter. Acclimatization is a polite word for slowly poisoning yourself in a controlled way. You go up, you let the lack of oxygen bruise your body, then you go down and hope that what doesn't kill you makes you just strong enough to go a little higher next time. On the north side of Everest, that rhythm becomes your entire life. Base camp at around 5,200 meters, interim camp, advanced base camp at 6,400, then the North Col, then the higher camps strung along the ridge like tiny, fragile beads. Days fell into a pattern. From base camp, we trudged over the rubble of the Rongbuk Glacier toward interim camp, weaving between ice towers that looked like frozen cathedrals. The air was dry enough to crack your lips open as you slept. At night, I could hear other climbers coughing in their tents, that hacking hollow sound that says the altitude is working on their lungs. We drank absurd amounts of fluid, swallowed pills, watched our urine as carefully as sailors watch the sky. Staying hydrated and clear-headed was our first line of defense in a place intent on narrowing the blood vessels to our brains. From interim, we moved to advanced base camp, ABC, at 6,400 meters. It sat in a wind-blasted bowl of rock and ice beneath the North Col. Here, the mountain began to feel serious. The ridges loomed high above, and every gust slammed the tents with a violence that made conversation pause mid-sentence. I remember stepping out one morning and seeing prayer flags strung between rock cairns, snapping so hard they sounded like whips. Somewhere above that flapping plastic was the route to the summit ridge. To get there, we first had to reach the col itself. The climb to the North Col is often described as straightforward, fixed ropes, steady angle. Technically simple. Straightforward is a strange word to use at over 7,000 meters. On our first carry-up, my pack felt twice its actual weight. My breathing became loud inside my hood, a metronome of effort. Step, gasp, step, gasp. The glacier rose in long, sweeping slopes broken by crevasses and seracs, white plains that hid sudden blue jaws under their surface. I'd been at altitude many times before, but returning in my 50s made me acutely aware that experience has two faces. On one side, it gives you better judgment, a refined sense for when to push and when to pull back. On the other, it can feed a dangerous confidence. I've done this before. I know what my body can handle. The truth is that your body at 50 is not your body at 30, no matter how many mountains you've climbed. As we clipped into the fixed lines and began zigzagging up the face toward the col, I felt that duality in every step. Part of me moved automatically, comfortable with crampons and rope, placing my feet as I'd done for decades. Another part whispered accounting questions. How fast is your heart beating? How much are you sweating? How clear is your thinking? Those questions would matter later, but in the bright, hard light of that first climb, they were easy to push aside. We reached the North Col and established our first camp on the actual body of Everest, a plateau of hard snow cut out of the slope, tents anchored by ice screws and hope. Looking back down the route, ABC looked suddenly small, a scatter of dots far below. Looking up, the ridge rose in a series of ribs and steps toward Camp 2, 3, and 4, then finally the summit pyramid. I stood there, lungs burning, and thought, this is it. This is the ladder we'll climb to the top of the world. Acclimatization rotations blurred together after that, up to the col, sleep a night, down to ABC to recover. Back up again, pushing a little higher along the ridge before retreating. Each cycle stole a bit of weight from my body and a bit of sharpness from my mind, but it also built something less tangible, a familiarity with thin air that would later, some doctors believe, help me survive a night where no one should have. As the weeks passed, something else happened. People began to fall away. One climber developed a persistent fluid rattle in his lungs, high-altitude pulmonary edema flirting with full bloom. He turned back toward home. Another suffered headaches that no amount of rest or medication could quiet. He descended before those pulses behind his eyes could turn into swelling inside his skull. Everest was already sorting us with an indifferent hand. In our small Australian group, I found myself one of the few still moving strongly above the col. It felt like vindication. All those years in the mountains, all those smaller expeditions, they seemed to be paying off. I could go higher while others stopped. I told myself it was because I respected the mountain, because I was careful, measured, experienced. What I didn't realize was that Everest sometimes rewards you with exactly the rope you'll later hang yourself from. During one rest day at ABC, I sat in the mess tent with a mug of something hot between my hands, watching snow whip past the entrance like static on a television screen. Someone asked what I'd do if I finally reached the summit this time. I joked about writing another book, giving more lectures, maybe hanging up my crampons on a high note. Beneath the humor, there was a quiet hunger. I wanted that summit badly. I wanted to stand on top of the mountain that had framed my adult life, to feel, even briefly, that the arc begun in 1984 had finally closed. Desire like that is not inherently dangerous. It becomes dangerous when you mix it with fatigue, thin air, and the subtle brain damage that hypoxia and altitude can inflict. Day by day, rotation by rotation, Everest was trimming away my margins. My body was adapting, yes, but it was also being pushed closer to its ceiling. The trouble with ceilings is that you rarely see them clearly until you hit them. When the word finally came over the radio that the route was fixed to the summit and a weather window was approaching, the whole camp seemed to hold its breath. The acclimatization phase was ending. The real climb, the one people would talk about, the one the cameras were waiting for, was about to begin. I lay in my tent that night at ABC, listening to the generator thrum and the wind tear at the guy lines. And I thought of my family back in Australia. I imagined Deb reading updates, my boys checking the expedition website, waiting for news. I told myself I owed them caution, that I would turn back if things looked bad. I also told myself, in a quieter, more private voice, that this might be my last chance. Two truths, held at once, pulling in opposite directions. As we began carrying loads back up to the North Col to stage for our summit push, I didn't yet know which of those truths would win, or how much it would cost to find out. Summit day always starts the same way, with the lie that you've slept. No one truly sleeps at 8,300 meters. You doze in 5-minute snatches while the wind paws at the tent, and your heart beats too loudly in your ears. When my watch finally glowed midnight in the cramped darkness of Camp 3 on the North Ridge, I was already half awake, half rehearsing the climb I'd been waiting more than 20 years to finish. We boiled water with hands that didn't quite feel like ours, forcing down noodles and tea our stomachs didn't really want. Outside, the night sang its usual song, fabric snapping, ice pellets ticking against the fly, muffled voices of other teams preparing for their own chance. The plan was straightforward on paper. Leave Camp 3 around 12:30 a.m., climb past the Mushroom Rock and the series of steeper steps, reach the summit by late morning, and be back at camp by early afternoon. I checked myself like a pilot before takeoff. Pulse fast, but not frightening. Head clear enough. No pounding behind the eyes. No fluid in my lungs that I could feel. Years of experience told me I was in good shape for a push. Years of experience did not tell me that cerebral edema can arrive like a thief between one breath and the next. We stepped into the darkness. The line of headlamps above us looked like a slow-moving constellation stitched to the ridge. The slope steepened, snow squeaked under crampons, oxygen hissed through my mask in a steady, controlled rhythm. I fell into the old pattern, count steps to keep my mind from wandering, use small goals, reach that rock, that bend, that next anchor on the rope. Higher up, the wind eased and the cold deepened. With less air movement, the temperature can actually drop, and the lack of oxygen wraps itself around your thoughts. I felt it first as a softening of edges. Sounds seemed to arrive through cotton. My own voice, when I spoke to the Sherpas, sounded like someone else's. Dawn came slowly, a grey smear over the Tibetan plateau. The world below shrank into shadow. Above, the ridge curled toward the summit pyramid in a series of crests that never seemed to end. We moved through the Mushroom Rock area, a bulge of rock and snow around 8,500 meters, and I took comfort in the fact that the route was familiar in shape, if not in memory. I'd studied this ridge obsessively, traced it with my finger on photographs, dreamed it. But dreams don't prepare you for what happens when your brain begins to swell inside your skull, somewhere above Mushroom Rock. Something in me shifted. The rope in front of me stopped being a rope. It became, for a moment, a garden hose in my backyard. The slope flattened in my perception. I was no longer on a knife edge above a 2-kilometer drop. I was walking along a roof, or a path, or home. I remember one particular hallucination with uncomfortable clarity. I became convinced I was standing on the balcony of a house near the sea in Australia, and that the Sherpas were house guests I'd failed to look after properly. I worried they hadn't been offered enough tea. My response to this imagined social disaster was to slow down, to turn and talk, to fuss with my clothing, as if I were changing shirts before company arrived. From the outside, of course, it looked very different. To the Sherpas, I was a climber whose balance was going, whose speech had become meandering and strange, whose judgment was dissolving in real time. They saw the classic signs of high-altitude cerebral edema, haze, progressing on the ridge, confusion, hallucinations, lack of coordination. They tried to push me downward. I resisted. Hypoxia has a cruel way of convincing you that you're the sane one and everyone else has lost the plot. In my warped mind, they were dragging me away from the house when guests were due any minute. I fought them, argued, pulled away from the rope. Each unnecessary movement burned oxygen I couldn't spare, and each moment of delay pushed us further into the danger zone of the day. Yet somehow, despite that chaos, we reached the summit. The details are patchy in my memory. A blur of prayer flags, the curve of the world below, my hand clumsily touching the highest snow on Earth. There is a summit photo of me from that day. Goggles on, hood up, the classic pose every climber dreams of. When I look at it now, I see something most people miss. My stance is just a fraction off. My smile is a little too loose at the edges. Behind the triumph there is already the fog of a brain that has begun to drown in its own fluids. We did not stay long. On the North Ridge, you can't. The air is too thin, the clock too loud. My team turned me around and pointed me downward. That, in theory, is the easier direction. Gravity helps. The summit is behind you. Home lies below. But haste as we began doesn't the care descent, about theory. My ability to do the most basic things, clip into the rope, manage my crampons, lean the right way on the ladder rungs, started to fray. The Sherpas would later tell other climbers and journalists that I kept stopping, that I tried to strip off essential clothing, that I insisted I was fine when I could barely stand. From inside my skull, it felt as if reality was sliding around on loose rails. For a few steps I'd be lucid, aware that we were on Everest, that we had to move quickly, that dark was coming. Then, just as suddenly, I'd be somewhere else entirely, on that imaginary balcony again, or in a warm bed, or in a tent far lower on the mountain. I remember thinking with complete conviction that I could simply lie down for a short rest and sort everything out later. That thought, I'll just rest here for a moment, has killed more people in the high mountains than avalanches. As the ridge began to tilt back toward the fearsome rock of the second step, the Sherpas were fighting two battles at once, against the mountain and against me. They knew what I did not, that every misstep in this state could be fatal for all of us, and that their own oxygen and daylight were running out. I was no longer just a teammate. I was a 70-kilogram problem attached to them by rope. Summit Day is supposed to be the chapter where everything comes together, where training and planning and luck align. For me, May 25, 2006 was the day everything began to come apart. I had stood on top of Everest at last. I had the photo, the proof, the tick on the list. But as we edged toward the second step, with my mind breaking away from the mountain, I was about to discover another truth. On Everest, reaching the top is not the climax of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of the fall. The second step on Everest's north side is only about 40 meters of climbing, but at 8,600 meters it might as well be a wall between the living and the dead. On the way up that morning, my memory of it is fragmentary. Metal ladder, cold rungs under my crampons, brief flashes of exposure as I moved over the void. On the way down, the second step became the place where my mind and body finally fell out of sync. By the time we reached it again, the summit already behind us, the day had aged more than it should have. Hypoxia slows everything. Your speech, your decision-making, your feet. I was moving like a man underwater, pausing too often, drifting into patches of hallucination that felt as real as the rock under my hands. The Sherpas knew we were late. They could see the shadows stretching across the ridge, feel the temperature dropping, watch the needles on their oxygen gauges sliding toward the red. I, meanwhile, had become preoccupied with problems that did not exist. At one point I became convinced my harness wasn't on properly. Though it was. I stopped, fumbled with the straps, argued when they tried to push me along the rope. Each minute we lost up, there was stolen directly from our margin for survival. Descending the second step should have taken minutes. It took hours. The route involves edging along a narrow ledge, working down a short rock wall, aided by the famous ladder, then negotiating tangled fixed ropes that bear the history of years of expeditions. In my condition, every move became a negotiation between my failing balance and gravity. The Sherpas were effectively lowering a semi-conscious man down one of the most exposed features on the mountain. They shouted instructions. I misheard them or heard them as part of a different story entirely. Once I thought they were telling me to welcome guests to a party. Another time, I became convinced we were rehearsing a climbing scene for the documentary, and that none of it was truly dangerous. That's the cruelty of cerebral edema. It doesn't just make you weak, it edits the entire script of reality. At some point on or just below the second step, my cooperation stopped. I sat down when I should have stood. I tried to unclip when I should have stayed attached. My legs refused commands. The Sherpas physically hauled me, pushed from behind, pulled from in front, their own boots scraping for purchase on the rock. According to later reports, bringing me down that single obstacle alone took close to 4 hours. 4 hours above 8,600 meters with barely any oxygen left, fighting both the mountain and a man who didn't understand he was dying. Further along the ridge, somewhere between the rock triangle and mushroom rock, my body simply shut down. I don't remember the exact moment. In my fractured recollections, the hard edge between rock and sky blurred. I felt overwhelmingly sleepy, the kind of bone-deep fatigue you might feel after days of insomnia. Lying down seemed not only reasonable, but irresistible. I folded onto the snow. The Sherpas tried to lift me, shouted in my face, slapped my cheeks through frozen gloves. My head lolled. Words, if they came, were nonsense. My breathing grew shallow, ragged. In the thin air, under layers of clothing and years of exhaustion etched into their own bodies, they struggled to find a pulse they could trust. Once, twice, 3 times they checked. My responses, they later said, dwindled to nothing. From inside, it felt like sinking into a warm bath. The pain receded. The urgency that had driven me upward for 2 decades evaporated. There was only drifting and images from home, my sons, Deb, sunlight on the veranda. I was no longer on a razor-thin ridge above Tibet. I was halfway between worlds, and part of me was content to stay there. For the Sherpas, the equation was brutal and clear. They had been in the death zone for close to 19 hours. Their oxygen was gone. 2 of them were developing snow blindness. All of them were dehydrated and staggering. Every minute they stayed with me increased the chance that more than one person would die on that ridge. At around 5:20 p.m., after repeated attempts to move me produced nothing, they radioed the expedition leader below and reported what they believed to be true. I was dead. Orders came back through the static, orders that no one ever wants to give, and no Sherpa ever wants to hear, but which keep being issued on mountains like Everest. Leave him, save yourselves. They did what protocol and survival demanded. They took my pack, my spare oxygen, my sleeping bag, food and water, supplies that might still keep other living climbers alive, and arranged my body so it wouldn't immediately slide off the ridge. My eyes were closed. My chest moved so little it was hard to tell if there was any breath left at all. In their minds, and in the minds of the climbers at lower camps listening to the radio, Lincoln Hall had just joined the long, sad list of those who never came back. Down on the mountain, word spread quickly. At advanced base and further below, people offered condolences. Somewhere in Australia, late at night, my family received a call no one should ever have to answer. I had died on Everest. Up on the ridge, the Sherpas stayed with me another 2 hours, longer than many people realize, hoping for any sign of life, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. As darkness thickened and their own strength failed, they finally unclipped from the rope near my body and turned downward. Their headlamps moved away in the black, tiny islands of light swallowed by the slope. When the last of those lights disappeared, the wind and the mountain reclaimed the ridge. I lay alone at roughly 8,600 meters. More object than person now, one more still shape on a route already stained with too many. From the perspective of everyone who mattered, my story ended there. But the human body, and whatever you choose to call the thing that animates it, doesn't always respect the timing we assign. I have been told that when the Sherpas finally left me, the sun was gone, and the ridge was already falling into shadow. I don't remember their last words. For them, that moment was a decision. For me, it felt like a slipping of stitches in the fabric of the world. One instant there were shapes moving around me, hands shaking my shoulders, voices shouting through the wind. The next, there was only the wind, and then even that began to fade. People imagined death on Everest as violent, a fall, an avalanche, some cinematic end. Mine began quietly. First came a heavy warmth, which is absurd when you consider where I was. My body temperature was dropping, blood thickening in the cold, yet inside my head I felt a soft, spreading heat. Hypothermia sometimes does that. As it steals your heat, it convinces you that you're finally comfortable. I stopped shivering. That is never a good sign. My vision narrowed, not like the abrupt closing of curtains, but like watching fog roll in from the edges of your sight. The hard lines of rock and snow blurred, stars smeared into pale streaks. Somewhere far away my heart slowed, each beat a little further apart than the last. I later learned that at this point, when breathing has almost stopped but some faint flicker of consciousness remains, Tibetan Buddhists say you've entered the deeper stages of the death process. I had been drawn to Tibetan Buddhism for years. I'd read about the 8 stages of dying: earth dissolving into water, water into fire, fire into air, the senses shutting down one by one while inner visions appear. Sparks, then smoke, then the glow of moonlight, then the red of sunset, ending in blackness before the clear light of death. Sitting there at 8,600 meters, half frozen on the ridge, I wasn't consciously ticking off stages. But later, when I tried to reconstruct that night, I recognized some of the signposts. First was the loss of physical power. My limbs no longer belonged to me. I could sense them in a distant way, weight at the ends of my body, but I couldn't move them. There was no urgency to try. The second stage, and they say, is the loss of control over fluids, breath and warmth. My mouth was dry as stone. My breath, when it came, was shallow and cold. The third and fourth stages involve the fading of sight, smell and taste, the flickering of thoughts. That matched what I remember: the ridge dissolving into a grey smear, the wind turning mute, ideas breaking apart before they formed. Then there were images, not the wild, disjointed hallucinations I'd had earlier, cups of tea, social visits, documentary scenes, but something slower, more elemental. I saw light, then red, then a kind of deep, comforting darkness, like lying at the bottom of a well and looking up at a small circle of sky. These may have been nothing more than the last firework bursts of a brain starved of oxygen. They may also have been the white, red, and black visions described in the texts I'd read. At some point, I stopped distinguishing between inside and outside. The mountain, the sky, my own body, they all folded into one sensation of floating. The pain in my hands and feet vanished. Fear was gone. Regret, too. There was, briefly, an overwhelming sense of acceptance. So this is how it ends. Medical descriptions of what was happening to me talk about cerebral edema, hypoxia, and hypothermia. My brain was swelling with fluid inside a rigid skull. The cold slowed the chemical reactions that keep organs alive. The lack of oxygen pushed neurons into silence. In a hospital with monitors and doctors, they would have called it terminal. On Everest, there were no monitors, only a body slumped on a ridge, gradually matching the temperature of the rock beneath it. And yet, even as I drifted, some small ember of awareness stayed lit. It didn't argue or panic, it simply observed. When images of my family rose, Deb's face, my sons as boys running on a beach, it watched them pass like clouds. When the thought came, "You are dying," it nodded. When another thought followed, not yet, it didn't resist. It just held both truths for a moment, the way a climber might hold two strands of rope, feeling their weight. I cannot tell you how long that in-between state lasted. In the death zone, time breaks apart. Minutes stretch, hours collapse. The night crept over the north face, temperatures falling toward the kind of cold that stops hearts in healthy people, let alone a man who had spent a full day above 8,000 meters. Below, camps settled into uneasy sleep. Radios went quiet. My death, as far as anyone knew, was a closed chapter. Up on the ridge, the 8 stages of dying continued their slow, impersonal work. My consciousness dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. There were moments of total black, then flickers of something like dawn behind my eyes. The texts say that at the very end, the gross mind dissolves, and only the subtlest awareness remains, a clear light before whatever comes next. Maybe I reached that. Maybe I hovered just short of it. All I know is that at some invisible tipping point, the process stopped moving forward. Instead of crossing fully into death, I hung there, between breaths, between thoughts, between worlds. From a scientific perspective, you could say the cold and altitude pushed my body into a kind of suspended animation, slowing everything just enough that complete shutdown didn't quite occur. From a spiritual perspective, you might say karma, prayer, sheer stubbornness, or the prayers of monks I'd met in Tibet held me there. From my perspective on that ridge, there were no labels. There was only darkness, the feel of stone under my body, and a distant, almost imperceptible sense that some part of me was still waiting for something. The mountain believed I was finished. The climbers below believed it. My own family, half a world away, had been told it was true. But the 8 stages of dying, it seems, can sometimes run in reverse. The night does not end with a clean edge in the death zone. It thins slowly, the black lifting to dark blue, then to the color of an old bruise. I became aware of morning not because of light, but because of sound. The wind changed pitch. Somewhere, far below the fog inside my skull, a thought surfaced. I am still here. That realization did not bring clarity. When consciousness returned, it came in ragged strips. I remember feeling upright before I knew how I'd gotten that way. Later, climber Miles Osborne would write that when they first saw me, I was sitting cross-legged on the ridge, 2 feet from a 3,000-meter drop, in the process of changing my shirt. Imagine, for a moment, the scene from their perspective. It's about 7:30 a.m. on May 26, 2006. A small team led by American climber Dan Mazza is 8 hours into their own summit push up the North Ridge. Conditions are perfect. No wind, clear sky, the kind of rare, calm window that climbers dream about. They round a corner just below the second step and see something that should not exist. Not a frozen body, not an abandoned pack. A man. He is sitting on the snow, jacket unzipped to the waist, arms out of the sleeves, no hat, no gloves, no goggles, no oxygen mask, no ice axe, no pack, no sleeping bag, no food, no water. At 8,600 meters, that combination should equal a corpse. Instead, this man, me, is moving slowly, muttering to himself, fussing with his clothing as if he were in his lounge room preparing for visitors. They approached cautiously, unsure whether they were walking toward a hallucination of their own. I looked up. Through the blur of wind and light, faces appeared, strangers in downsuits, silhouettes against the sky. Some rational part of me must have understood what I was seeing, because the words that came out of my mouth belonged to a different world entirely. "I imagine you're surprised to see me here," I said. It wasn't a deliberate joke, but people have laughed at that line ever since. To me, it felt like a simple statement of fact. I had been declared dead. I had spent a night alone in a place where no one expects to witness another sunrise. Yet here I was, sitting in the snow like a man waiting for a bus. The climbers, Dan Mazza, Andrew Brash, Miles Osborne and Jangbu Sherpa, were, in their own words, completely dumbstruck. They had been 2 hours away from the summit, feeling strong, climbing under a flawless sky. Now they were confronted with a choice that cut straight through the mythology that had begun to cling to Everest. Continue upward and join the long line of successful summit photos, or stay with a dying man and write a very different kind of story. From my side of the conversation, things were even stranger. I drifted in and out of sense. Sometimes I knew I was on Everest and that something had gone horribly wrong. Other times, I slipped back into delusion. At one point, I was convinced they were filming a commercial and kept asking when the director would call cut. Another time, I told them quite calmly that I had fallen off the mountain and was now dead, which, in a bureaucratic sense at least, was accurate. They checked me the way my Sherpas had done the night before: pulse, breathing, pupils. The difference now was time of day and their own condition. They were fresh compared to the team that had fought with me for hours. They still had oxygen, daylight, reserves of strength, and crucially, I was sitting up, talking, and as Dan later put it, able to walk with help. Those two facts would make the difference between my story and that of British climber David Sharp, who died alone in a cave not far away that same season. I was also, despite appearances, in serious trouble. My fingers and toes were already deeply frostbitten. My brain was swollen from cerebral edema. My core temperature sat well below where it should have been for a man who intended to keep living. Unclothed skin on my hands and face had turned waxy, the color of old candles, yet the brain is a stubborn organ. It had stitched together a new reality in which being half naked on Everest made perfect sense. The team spent the next hours doing the simplest, hardest work in high-altitude rescue, keeping me alive and awake long enough for help to arrive. They dressed me again, forced gloves onto hands that no longer felt like part of my body, pulled a hat down over my ears, rigged a makeshift anchor so I wouldn't slide off the ridge if I collapsed. They shared their own oxygen, taking turns to give me sips through a mask. They coaxed me to drink and talk, knowing that language is a fragile bridge to consciousness in someone with brain swelling. When I began to drift, they pulled me back with questions about my family, my home, simple details that could keep a thread of Lincoln connected to the man on the ridge. Most importantly, they made a decision. Dan got on the radio, reported their situation, and informed his team that they were abandoning their summit bid. "The summit will always be there," he would later say. "Lincoln only has one life. Down at lower camps, that choice provoked both admiration and uncomfortable comparison. Only days earlier, Sharp had been passed by dozens of climbers who judged his condition hopeless and continued upward. Many asked why my life was worth a massive rescue effort when his had not been. One cold, pragmatic answer was that I was conscious and capable of moving with assistance while he was not. Another, less comfortable answer is that human beings can be moved to extraordinary compassion by eye contact and conversation in a way they sometimes are not by a motionless shape in the dark. On the ridge, those debates did not matter yet. For the four men around me, the situation was simple and immediate. Keep Lincoln Hall talking, breathing and upright until reinforcements arrived. For me, it was stranger still. I existed in loops. I would ask where we were. They would tell me. I would nod, then moments later ask again. I cracked jokes, some of them apparently terrible. I apologized for ruining their summit day, then forgot I had done so and apologized again. The mountain watched all of this with complete indifference. To the wind, to the ice, to the thin air at 8,600 meters, we were just small, moving shapes. The fact that I had crossed an invisible border, declared dead one evening, found alive the next morning, meant nothing to Everest. But to the people on that ridge and to the families listening for fresh news at home, it meant everything. My story had slipped out of the category of tragedy into something much rarer and harder to explain. For the second time in 24 hours, strangers on Everest had to decide what my life was worth to them. The night before, weighing their own survival, men who believed me to be gone had chosen to leave. That morning, weighing a different set of risks, another group chose to stay. Both decisions, viewed from within their circumstances, made sense. I was the constant in both equations, a man in the death zone whose fate would be written not only by physics and physiology, but by the choices of others. If being left alone on the ridge was my first rebirth, the descent that followed was my second. Survival is rarely a single miracle, it's a chain of them. Mine began with 4 strangers giving up their summit, but it did not end there. While Dan Mazur's team sat with me, sharing oxygen and disbelief, something remarkable was happening below. News that I was alive, after a night at 8,600 meters without shelter, sparked what some called an unprecedented rescue on the north side. Expedition leader Alex Abramov, who only hours before had announced my death, reversed course and dispatched a column of Sherpas up the mountain, 12 in total, carrying oxygen, warm clothing, and the kind of stubborn strength that only comes from years spent in thin air. I knew none of this. Up on the ridge, my world had shrunk to the patch of snow beneath me and the faces in front of me. My memory of those hours is a mosaic. I remember Dan's eyes behind his goggles, steady and focused. I remember someone holding a bottle of fluid to my lips, urging me to drink. I remember the glove on my hand, someone else's glove, pulled onto fingers that no longer hurt because they'd gone beyond pain into something colder. Then more figures appeared, climbing up from below, Sherpas from my own expedition. Men I recognized in flashes, Keeper, Dorje and others, moving with a purpose that cut through the fog. They thanked Mazur's team, clipped me to a new set of ropes, and began the brutal work of bringing me down from 8,600 meters to the North Pole. Rescue at that altitude doesn't look like a neat stretcher carry. It looks like dragging, coaxing, supporting, sometimes simply hoping gravity is on your side. For hours, the Sherpas took turns holding me up, half carrying, half walking me down steep sections where a misstep from any of us would have meant the end. When my legs worked, they used them. When they didn't, they hauled. The route was the same I'd climbed days earlier during acclimatization, but now it was a gauntlet. We moved past the second step, which I barely registered this time, then down through the rock bands and snow slopes toward Mushroom Rock and the upper ridge. My brain drifted in and out. At moments, I was lucid enough to understand that these men were saving my life. At others, I slipped back into the belief that I was simply going for a walk with old friends. What I do remember vividly is the sound of my crampons skittering on hard ice when my legs buckled. The Sherpas would yank me upright, shout commands, "Stand, move your foot, lean in," and I would obey with the slow reflexes of a man underwater. Their patience was extraordinary. They were exhausted themselves, carrying extra loads, breathing from their own limited oxygen supplies, yet they kept me moving. Somewhere above the North Pole, the sky changed again. Clouds drifted in. The light flattened, turning the ridge into a monochrome world where depth and distance were hard to judge. We were racing not just gravity and physiology, but time. The longer I stayed up high, the greater the chance that frostbite would claim more of me, that my brain would swell again, that some delayed collapse would undo all the work already done. And yet, step by broken step, we descended. At one point the slope steepened enough that I had to be lowered on a short rope, Sherpas bracing themselves above while I slid awkwardly down the face, boots scraping, body scraping, dignity an irrelevant luxury. I remember apologizing. I apologized a lot that day, for my weight, for the trouble, for ruining their schedule. It's a strange thing to feel guilty for being alive, but in that inverted world, where climbers measure triumph in summits, I understood that my survival had cost many people their own shot at the top. By evening, we were approaching the North Pole at around 7,000 meters. Compared to the ridge, it felt almost like sea level, though in truth it's higher than any peak in Europe. Tents glowed orange through the thin air. The sight of them cut through my fog like a flare. Home would still be further down, but this place, flat ground, thicker air, a doctor, was the first real threshold back toward the living. At 9 p.m., according to the expedition reports, we finally stumbled into camp. A Russian doctor, Andrei Selivanov, met us at the edge of the col. In my memory, he is a blur of headlamp and steady hands, cutting away frozen clothing, assessing blackened fingers and toes, checking my pupils, listening to my chest. He kept watch through the night while the Sherpas collapsed into their tents, spent from a rescue that had spanned more than a full day. For the first time since the summit push began, I slept without hallucinations. It was not the sleep of a healthy man. My brain and body were still deep in crisis, but the altitude had dropped enough that my cells could finally begin to pull in more oxygen than they were spending. In the simple math of the death zone, that alone was a miracle. The next day, propped up, swaddled in bandages, I walked the final stretch from the North Pole down to advanced base camp. Every step hurt. My feet felt both numb and full of needles. My hands, heavily wrapped, throbbed with the beginning of the damage that would eventually cost me fingertips and a toe. Yet I moved under my own power, surrounded by teammates who had once written my obituary and now weren't quite sure what category to file me under. Dead man walking, ghost, patient. When we reached ABC, someone showed me my hands. The tips of several fingers were grey, others waxy white, all of them useless clubs at the ends of my arms. I knew enough about frostbite to understand what that meant. I would keep my life, but parts of me were already scheduled for amputation. That realization came not with panic, but with a strange calm. The bargain had been struck. I was alive. The mountain had taken its fee. In the days that followed, I would be helicoptered out, treated in hospitals, and slowly reintroduced to a world where air comes thick and effortless. Doctors would puzzle over my case, using words like medical mystery and physiological outlier. Sherpas and climbers would argue about decisions made high on the ridge, who stayed, who left, and why. But in that window between the ridge and the hospital bed, moving down from the North Pole with bandaged hands and a head full of half-remembered visions, I understood only one thing with absolute clarity. No summit is worth what those 12 Sherpas and 4 foreign climbers gave up to bring me back. The strangest part of coming back from the dead is that the world insists on treating you like you're alive. By the time I left the mountain, helicopters and stretchers had replaced ropes and ladders. The roar of rotors over Tibet felt almost obscene after the thin hiss of oxygen at 8,000 meters. In the aircraft, I wore dark glasses, partly to shield my frost-burned eyes, partly to hide the simple fact that I had no idea yet how to be the person everyone suddenly believed me to be: a survivor, a miracle, a headline. Hospitals have their own altitude. Time behaves strangely there too. Days blurred into a cycle of examinations, questions, and the sterile smell of disinfectant instead of ice and sweat. Doctors peered at scans of my brain, tracing the outlines of edema that had, by their standards, come perilously close to killing me. They asked how long I'd been without oxygen, without shelter, without warmth. When I told them 12 hours marooned in the death zone, a full night above 8,600 meters alone, they shook their heads. "You should not be here," one said simply. Frostbite made more immediate sense to everyone. The damage on my fingers and feet was obvious. Blackened tissue at the tips, skin like porcelain where blood no longer flowed. Surgeons explained the options. We could wait to see exactly how much of me the mountain had claimed, but some parts were already beyond saving. In the end, I lost 8 fingertips and my right big toe, a small tax compared to what Everest has taken from so many others. Rehabilitation was humbling. Tasks that had once been automatic, buttoning a shirt, tying shoelaces, holding a pen, suddenly required concentration and workarounds. My hands looked like someone else's, blunt and clumsy. Yet each small victory, a cup lifted without spilling, a page turned without help, felt like a summit of its own. The more difficult recovery, though, took place in my head. The cerebral edema receded on the scans, but the echoes of that swelling remained. For months my thoughts came with a slight delay, like a radio broadcast bouncing off the ionosphere. My short-term memory was unreliable. I struggled to disentangle dream from event. When I tried to piece together that night on the ridge, reality and hallucination overlapped like two badly aligned transparencies. I'd wake in the dark. Sure, I was back at 8,600 meters, the hiss of an oxygen mask in my ears that wasn't there. The 8 stages of dying I'd once studied as a philosophical curiosity now lived as vivid sense memories. The warmth, the narrowing of sight, the strange lights behind my eyes. It took time and writing to put those experiences into a narrative I could live with. That narrative eventually became my book, Dead Lucky. Life After Death on Mount Everest. With publicity came questions, and with questions came ethics. People wanted to know why I survived when others didn't. They asked about Sherpas who left and Sherpas who returned, about Dan Maz's decision to sacrifice his summit, about David Sharp dying alone in a cave on the north side only days earlier. I found myself drawn into debates I hadn't asked for. In a round table on the ethics of climbing, I said something that still feels true. David chose a purer, lonelier style, with no backup and no margin. I understood the appeal of that. I also understood intimately how easy it is up there to drift toward the welcoming comfort of sleep, only to be there for eternity. I had walked that path and, for reasons no doctor could fully explain, stepped back from it. Did I deserve more effort than he did? No. Did circumstance, timing, and the simple fact that I could stand and speak make it more realistic to save me than it had been to save him? Yes. Those are uncomfortable truths, but the mountain does not care whether our answers are comfortable. As the years passed, my life settled into a new shape. I returned to public speaking, to guiding, to writing. My damaged hands became part of the story, visual punctuation for the tale of a night when physics and probability were briefly cheated. I learned to live with the knowledge that I had been declared dead, my wife had taken that call, my children had stared at that news, and then returned. In 2012, cancer, not cold, finally finished what Everest began. Mesothelioma, likely from asbestos exposure earlier in life, claimed the body the mountain had spared. By then, I had come to see my survival on Everest not as proof of invincibility, but as a reminder of how thin the boundary is between staying and going. If there is a single lesson in that, one I tried to pass on in interviews, in Dead Lucky, in quiet conversations with climbers planning their own expeditions, it is this: the summit is never worth more than a life, including your own. Courage in the death zone is not just about going up in thin air. Sometimes it's about having the strength to turn back or to stop, like Maz's team did. For a stranger sitting on the roof of the world saying, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." People love to call my story a miracle, as if that word could tie a neat bow around everything that happened on the north side of Everest in May 2006. I understand the impulse. Miracle is cleaner than cerebral edema, hypoxia, logistics, ethics, and grief. It sounds better on a book cover, too. But from where I stood, the truth is messier. Everest took plenty. It took pieces of my body, 8 fingertips and a toe, sacrificed to frostbite, and the simple physics of warm flesh exposed to impossible cold. It took chunks of my memory, carving blank spaces into the hours between collapsing on the ridge and waking in hospital. It took years of easy trust from my family, who had to learn how to live with the knowledge that, for one long night, I had already died in their minds. It also gave things back, in a currency I hadn't expected. Before 2006, I was known in a small world. Australian climbers, readers of my earlier books, people who cared about Himalayan routes and first ascents. After Dead Lucky came out and the story spread, my name became shorthand for something else: the man Everest killed on paper, then returned. With that recognition came responsibility. I found myself speaking not just about climbing, but about risk, ethics, and what we owe each other in dangerous places. In roundtables and interviews, I was asked over and over to revisit the comparison between my rescue and the death of David Sharp, 2 climbers on the same side of the same mountain in the same season. One abandoned in a cave, one pulled back from the ridge. I never claimed moral superiority. The differences were stark and practical. I was mobile and conscious when Maz's team found me. Sharp, by most accounts, was immobile and near silent when people passed. Moving a dead weight at 8,500 meters is almost impossible. Moving a staggering man who can respond to commands is merely very, very hard. I said as much when asked. And I also said this: it is terrifyingly easy up there to drift into sleep and stay there forever. I knew that path because I had felt its pull. If there is any message to extract from my survival, it isn't that the universe saves the deserving. It's that outcomes in the death zone hinge on 1,000 small variables: timing, weather, the angle of a fall, the remaining strength of strangers, the fact that 4 climbers happened to be in exactly the right place with the right amount of oxygen and the right inclination to stop. Change any one of those, and my story becomes another obituary instead of a documentary. In the years after Everest, I tried to put that understanding to use off the mountain. As a founding member of the Australian Himalayan Foundation, I worked to support education and health in the communities that live in the shadow of the peaks we treat as playgrounds. I wrote, spoke, and raised money, driven partly by gratitude and partly by a quiet debt. If I was going to walk away from a ridge where most would have died, I owed something back to the region that had given me so much, and almost everything. Recognition followed, the kind I would once have associated with other people's lives. I was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for services to mountaineering, and later the Australian Geographic Society's Lifetime of Adventure Award. Those honours felt less like trophies and more like mirrors, reflecting back a version of myself I was still getting used to, not just climber or author, but the man who had become, unintentionally, a walking case study in where ambition and compassion meet at 8,000 meters. When mesothelioma finally arrived, years later, it did so without drama. No wind, no ice, no ropes. Just cells gone wrong in the quiet of my own body, likely seeded decades earlier on dusty building sites far from any glacier. People called it bitterly ironic that after surviving Everest's death zone, I would be undone by something as mundane as asbestos. I didn't see it that way. Mountains are only one of the places where risk lives. Looking back across it all, the boy from Canberra who loved hills, the young man on White Limbo, the middle-aged climber staggering on the North Ridge, the patient in a hospital bed turning pages with bandaged hands, one thread stands out. Again and again, I was given chances to stop. In 1984, when we turned back, in 2006 before the summit push, on the ridge when sleep seemed so inviting. Each time, some part of me chose to keep moving. That impulse can be deadly. It can also, occasionally, drag you back across a line you were never supposed to recross. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. The mountain will always be there. Your life, and the lives of those around you, will not. When you find yourself at any kind of edge, on a ridge, in a hospital, in a decision that could tip either way, ask not only what you might gain by going on, but what might be lost if you don't stop. Everest wrote my name on a list long before I ever saw it. In 2006, it tried to cross that name off. Thanks to a chain of human decisions and an inexplicable twist in the ordinary business of dying, the ink didn't quite take. If you visit the National Museum of Australia in Canberra, you can see my boots in a glass case. They are ordinary in the way all real climbing gear is ordinary: scuffed leather, worn rubber, creases where the ankle bends. A small plaque explains that these boots stood on the summit of Everest on 25th of May 2006 and then, improbably, walked back from the edge of death. Objects like that make it easy to believe stories are fixed things. Here is the boot. Here is the label. Here is the miracle. But the truth is that experiences like mine don't end neatly when the helicopter lands or the bandages come off. They echo. They shift. They raise questions that don't fit into a museum caption. In the years after Everest, I was often asked what I had learned from dying and coming back. People wanted a sentence they could write down, something tidy: life is fragile, follow your dreams, never give up. I could have offered those. They're all true in their way, but when I searched for words that felt honest, I kept circling back to something more complicated. On a stage once, I said, "Keep your eyes wide open in the darkest moments. That's when you'll see what's really there." Those dark moments might be a storm at 8,000 meters, or a diagnosis in a doctor's office, or a point in your life when everything familiar has fallen away. Everest taught me that most of us walk through our days half asleep, blind to the edges we're drifting toward. For a few hours on that ridge, the edge was all I could see. People also wanted to know whether I was still drawn to risk. The honest answer was yes, but differently. Before 2006, I saw high places as stages where I could test myself, prove something to others, to the younger climber I'd once been, to the quiet voice that said almost every time I thought of Everest. Afterward, I saw them as mirrors. The mountain hadn't revealed anything noble in me when my brain swelled. It had revealed how quickly judgment can crumble, how easily a well-trained, experienced climber can become a danger to everyone around him. So when I spoke to young alpinists planning their first Himalaya expedition, I didn't tell them to stay home. I told them to be absolutely clear about why they were going and what they were willing to give up, and to cost others, to touch a point of snow on top of the world. Ambition is not the enemy. Thoughtless ambition is. I was also asked, more than once, if I believed some higher power had saved me. In Dead Lucky, I wrote about Tibetan Buddhism, about the 8 stages of dying, about feeling myself move through at least 2 of them on that ridge. I credited my survival in part to that devotion, and I still think there is truth in that. The practices I'd learned gave me a framework for what was happening as my body shut down, a way to meet that process with something other than panic. But when I stripped the story to its bones, what remains are people, Sherpas, who fought for hours to bring down a man they believed was gone. Climbers who walked away from a perfect summit morning because they could not ignore a stranger sitting in the snow saying, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." Doctors and nurses who spent nights monitoring a brain and body that medicine said should have failed. My family, who had the courage to grieve, and then, against all expectations, to welcome me back. Those are the anchors that kept me from disappearing into the statistics. Not fate, not destiny, choices. You, listening to this, may never set crampons on a glacier. Your death zone might be a hospital ward, a war zone, a depression no one else can see. The altitude is different, but the physics are the same. Limited time, limited strength. The temptation to look only at your own summit and ignore the person collapsing beside your path. Everest will outlast all of us. Long after my boots crack in their display and my name fades from plaques and book spines, the jet stream will still rake snow from the summit, and climbers will still line up on ridges, clipped to fixed ropes, chasing their private reasons for being there. Some will come home, some will not. If this story does anything, let it be a small counterweight to the glossy images and heroic narratives. Remember that on that mountain, and in many places like it, the real measure of a climber is not just how high they go, but what they do when someone else is in trouble. Remember that turning back can be the bravest move of all. And remember, finally, that there are moments when the line between life and death becomes so thin you can feel it under your feet like the edge of a cornice. On one of those nights, high above Tibet, I stood on that line, fell off it, and somehow landed back among the living. I can't tell you exactly why. I can only tell you what it felt like to open my eyes on a ridge where I was not supposed to exist and say, with all the understatement in the world, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." Everest loves to hide behind numbers. 8 out 848 meters, 8,000-meter death zone, so many permits, so many bodies left where they fell. Lincoln Hall's story tears straight through that abstraction and forces one blunt fact onto the table. Up there, every statistic had a name, a family, and at least one moment when someone had to choose whether to keep climbing or to stop. He was declared dead at 8,600 meters, gear stripped, farewell calls made, his name mentally added to Everest's long roll of the lost. 12 hours later, he was sitting upright on the ridge, half undressed, greeting new climbers with a dry line. "I imagine you're surprised to see me here," and proving that the death zone is less a clean border and more a grey, shifting frontier where physiology, chance and other people's courage intersect. What saved him in the end was not strength or experience or some special immunity to cold. It was a chain of human decisions, Sherpas who fought until they were ordered down, climbers who surrendered their own summit for a stranger, teams below who mounted a rescue most on that side of Everest had never seen attempted. The mountain did what it always does, thin air, brutal cold, no mercy. What changed the outcome was what people chose to do in the middle of all that. If this story stays with you, let it work against the glossy posters and ego-soaked summit selfies. Every time someone says Everest, like it's just a backdrop for ambition, remember a man who was written off as dead, found alive, and walked back into camp with frostbitten hands, and the rest of his life handed back to him on borrowed time. And if this journey through Lincoln Hall's night in the death zone made you see that mountain and every other extreme dream a little differently, don't let it vanish when the video ends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next true survival story. Hit like so this one reaches the people who still think it's just a big hike, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're listening from. Your dot on the map is proof that what happened on a narrow ridge above Tibet is still sending warnings, and maybe a little borrowed courage around the world.